Picture this. It's March 15th, 44 BCE. You're one of the most powerful men who ever lived. You've conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and basically turned the Roman Republic into your personal empire. You are Julius Caesar, and your name will become synonymous with absolute power for thousands of years. Emperors, Kaisers, and Tsars will all trace their titles back to you. But in just a few hours, you'll be lying dead on the Senate floor, stabbed 23 times by your own colleagues and friends. Now, I know what you're thinking. How does the most powerful man in Rome end up as ancient history's most famous murder victim? Keep watching, my friend, because the answer to your question will be explained in this video. Welcome back to Ancient Rome Revisited. I'm your host, Marcus Aurelius. Yes, that's right. One of the few Roman Caesars who didn't die a horrible death. Today, I'm going to take you inside the ultimate political thriller, a story of ambition, betrayal, and revenge that makes Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. Before we begin, though, if you love Roman history and want to learn more about the trials and tribulations of the people and the Republic of Rome, then click the subscribe button now and you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. If you have just clicked subscribe, then I, Marcus Aurelius, thank you. Now, this murder story begins with the very man himself, Julius Caesar, the man who had everything. Let me paint you a picture of just how powerful Julius Caesar had become by 44 BCE. Imagine if Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and the President of the United States were all the same person. That's basically Caesar's level of influence in Rome. He wasn't just wealthy. He controlled the largest military force in the Mediterranean world. He wasn't just famous. He was literally worshipped as a god in some provinces. And he wasn't just politically connected. He was the politics. Caesar had spent the previous decade conquering Gaul, that's modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Switzerland. He'd enslaved over 1 million people and killed another 1 million. But here's the thing about Caesar. He was also incredibly charismatic and genuinely cared about the common people of Rome. He threw massive public games, gave away free grain, and implemented debt relief programs. The average Roman citizen absolutely loved him. But there was one small problem with this arrangement. Rome was supposed to be a republic, not a dictatorship. For 500 years, the Romans had prided themselves on not having kings. They had this whole system where power was shared among senators, consuls, and other officials. Think of it like the difference between a democracy and a monarchy. Except Caesar was slowly turning their democracy into his personal kingdom. The conspiracy of all conspiracies. Now you might think that someone as powerful as Caesar would have seen this coming. After all, when you're systematically dismantling a 500-year-old political system, you're bound to make some enemies. But Caesar was dealing with what I like to call winner's syndrome, that dangerous overconfidence that comes from success after success. It's like when you're on a winning streak in Vegas and you think you're invincible, right up until you lose everything. The conspiracy against Caesar wasn't hatched by his enemies. It was organized by his friends and political allies. This is what makes the story so devastating. The two main architects of the plot were Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, and their motivations couldn't have been more different. Let's start with Brutus, because his story is the most tragic. Brutus was like Caesar's adopted son. Caesar had been having an affair with Brutus's mother for years, and some historians think Caesar might have actually been Brutus's biological father. Imagine growing up with your maybe dad being the most powerful man in Rome, showering you with privileges and opportunities. Caesar had fast-tracked Brutus's political career, given him important positions, and treated him like family. So why did Brutus want to kill him? Well, Brutus came from one of Rome's most prestigious families. His ancestor had been one of the founders of the Roman Republic. He'd grown up hearing bedtime stories about how his family had expelled the last king of Rome. To Brutus, Caesar's growing power wasn't just politically dangerous, it was a personal betrayal of everything his family stood for. It would be like if your family had fought in the American Revolution, and now someone was trying to make themselves king of America. Brutus felt like he had to choose between his loyalty to Caesar and his loyalty to Republican ideals. Unfortunately for Caesar, ideals won. Cassius, on the other hand, had much more personal motivations. This guy was basically the embodiment of political ambition. Think Frank Underwood from House of Cards, but with a toga. Cassius had expected to rise through the ranks of Roman politics in the traditional way, but Caesar's dominance had essentially put a ceiling on everyone else's careers. Why compete for second place when Caesar would always be first? Cassius was also reportedly jealous of Caesar's popularity and achievements. He once complained that Caesar was no better than any other man, yet he was treated like a god. It's that classic sentiment of, why him and not me? But here's where the story gets really interesting. Cassius knew he couldn't pull this off alone. Romans valued honor and tradition above almost everything else, so any assassination plot needed moral legitimacy. That's where Brutus came in. If Brutus, Caesar's beloved protege from one of Rome's founding families, was willing to kill Caesar, then maybe it really was necessary for the good of Rome. Recruiting the hit squad. Cassius spent months carefully recruiting conspirators. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a carefully orchestrated political operation that would have impressed modern campaign managers. He needed men who were respected, who had legitimate grievances against Caesar, and who were brave enough to actually go through with murder. The conspirators eventually numbered around 60 senators, but let me tell you about some of the key players. There was Decimus Brutus, not to be confused with Marcus Brutus, who was one of Caesar's most trusted generals. Caesar loved this guy so much that he'd named him as one of his heirs in his will. Talk about betrayal. There was also Gaius Trebonius, who had served under Caesar in Gaul, but felt he'd been passed over for promotion, and Publius Servilius Casca, who would actually strike the first blow. What's fascinating is how these men justified their actions to themselves. They weren't just murderers, they were liberators, saving Rome from tyranny. They even called themselves the Liberators. It's like how every revolution in history has claimed to be fighting for freedom and justice. These guys genuinely believed they were heroes, the Ides of March. Now, let's talk about the assassination itself, because the details are absolutely wild. First off, Caesar had been warned multiple times that something bad was going to happen. A soothsayer, basically an ancient fortune teller, had told him to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia had nightmares about his death and begged him not to leave the house that day. Even some of his friends had heard rumors about a plot. But Caesar had this fatal combination of arrogance and fatalism. He'd reportedly said that it was better to die suddenly than to live in constant fear. Plus, he'd disbanded his personal bodyguard because he thought it made him look weak. It would be like if a modern president decided to fire the Secret Service because he wanted to seem more relatable. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar almost didn't go to the Senate meeting. Calpurnia was so upset about her nightmares that she convinced him to stay home. But then Decimus Brutus, remember, this is the guy Caesar trusted so much he'd made him an heir, showed up at Caesar's house and basically guilt-tripped him into coming. What will people think if you don't show up? They'll say you're afraid of your own shadow. Come on, Julius, you're better than that. So Caesar went. As he was walking to the Senate house, he actually ran into that soothsayer who had warned him about the Ides of March. Caesar mockingly said, "The Ides of March have come," and the soothsayer replied, "Yes, but they haven't gone yet." Chilling, yeah? The murder. The assassination itself happened in the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting that day. The conspirators had positioned themselves strategically around the room. Their plan was brilliant in its simplicity. They would surround Caesar during a normal Senate proceeding and stab him to death before anyone could react. It started when a senator named Tillius Cimber approached Caesar with a petition. As Caesar was reading it, Cimber grabbed his toga and pulled it down from his shoulders. This was the signal. Suddenly, Publius Casca struck Caesar in the neck with a knife. What happened next was pure chaos. Caesar fought back initially, but as more and more conspirators joined the attack, he realized what was happening. Ancient sources tell us that Caesar fought back against his attackers until he saw Brutus among them. When he saw his beloved Brutus with a bloody knife, Caesar reportedly said, "Et tu, Brute?" "And you, Brutus?" and then stopped fighting back. The conspirators stabbed Caesar 23 times, though according to the autopsy, yes, they had autopsies in ancient Rome, only one wound was actually fatal. In a final act of dignity, Caesar pulled his toga over his head so no one would see him die. He collapsed at the base of a statue of Pompey, his former rival whom he'd defeated in the Civil War. The irony was not lost on anyone. The immediate aftermath. Now, here's where the conspirators' plan completely fell apart. They'd spent so much time planning the murder that they'd forgotten to plan what came next. It's like they'd planned the perfect heist, but forgot to think about the getaway car. The senators fled the building in panic. The conspirators were left standing there with bloody knives, expecting to be hailed as heroes. Instead, the Roman people were horrified. Caesar might have been a dictator, but he was their dictator, the one who gave them free grain and entertainment. Imagine if someone assassinated a popular president and then expected to be thanked for it. Marcus Brutus tried to give a speech explaining their actions, but the crowd was having none of it. The conspirators had to barricade themselves on the Capitoline Hill, basically the Roman equivalent of locking yourself in your house and hoping the angry mob goes away. Meanwhile, Caesar's body lay abandoned on the Senate floor for hours. Eventually, 3 slaves carried it home on a litter, with one arm hanging down and dragging on the ground. It was a pathetic end for one of history's greatest figures. Enter Mark Antony. This is where one of the most fascinating characters in Roman history takes center stage. Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony. If Caesar was Alexander the Great, then Antony was his Hephaestion, his closest friend, his right-hand man, and his designated successor. Antony had been waiting outside the Senate house when the assassination happened. When he heard what had occurred, he disguised himself as a slave and fled to his house. The guy was smart enough to realize that if they'd killed Caesar, he was probably next on the list. But Antony was also politically brilliant. While the conspirators were hiding on the Capitoline Hill patting themselves on the back, Antony was making deals. He negotiated with them through intermediaries, essentially saying, "Look, what's done is done. Let's not have a civil war. You can have amnesty, but I get to give Caesar's funeral speech." The conspirators agreed, thinking they were getting a great deal. They got to live, and all Antony got was the chance to make a speech. What could go wrong? The funeral that changed everything. Everything could go wrong. And it did. Antony's funeral oration for Caesar was the greatest piece of political theatre in ancient history. He stood up in front of the Roman people and basically said, "These men killed Caesar because they said he was ambitious. But let me tell you what this ambitious man did for you." Then he proceeded to list every benefit Caesar had given to the Roman people: the land distributions, the debt relief, the public games, the military bonuses. But the masterstroke was when Antony read Caesar's will aloud. Caesar had left his gardens to the public as a park, and he'd given every Roman citizen 75 denarii, about 3 months' wages for the average worker. Imagine if Jeff Bezos died and left every American citizen $10,000. The crowd went absolutely wild. Then Antony held up Caesar's bloody toga, pointing out each stab wound and naming the conspirator who had made it. The Roman people were whipped into a frenzy of grief and rage. They grabbed Caesar's body and burned it right there in the forum, using furniture and anything else they could find as fuel. Then they marched to the conspirators' houses with torches, fully intending to burn them down. The rise of Octavian. While all this was happening, an 18-year-old kid was traveling from Greece to Rome. His name was Gaius Octavius, but history would know him as Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. He was Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, and he'd just inherited one of the most famous names in world history. Nobody took Octavian seriously at first. He was just a teenager with no military experience and no political connections of his own. Cicero, the famous orator, called him a boy who owes everything to a name. Even Mark Antony dismissed him as irrelevant. But Octavian had something that everyone underestimated. He was absolutely ruthless and incredibly patient. While Antony was busy being dramatic and the conspirators were busy hiding, Octavian was quietly building his own power base. He started by claiming his inheritance from Caesar and using it to pay Caesar's promised bonuses to the legions. Suddenly, he had the loyalty of Caesar's veterans, arguably the most dangerous fighting force in the Mediterranean world. The Second Triumvirate. What happened next was like a political version of the Avengers, except instead of fighting supervillains, they were dividing up the Roman world between themselves. Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's former lieutenant, formed the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE. Their first order of business? Revenge. They created proscription lists, basically hit lists of their political enemies. If your name was on the list, you were declared an enemy of the state, your property was confiscated, and anyone could kill you for a reward. It was like putting a bounty on someone's head, except it was legal and government-sponsored. The most famous victim was Cicero, the great orator who had opposed both Caesar and Antony. When Antony's soldiers brought him Cicero's head and hands, Antony's wife reportedly pulled out Cicero's tongue and stabbed it with hairpins in revenge for all his speeches against her husband. Ancient Rome was not for the faint of heart. The Battle of Philippi. In 42 BCE, Antony and Octavian finally caught up with the main conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, at the Battle of Philippi in northern Greece. This was the moment of truth, the liberators versus the avengers, fighting for the soul of Rome. The battle was actually two separate engagements. In the first, Brutus defeated Octavian's forces, while Antony defeated Cassius. But Cassius, thinking the entire battle was lost, committed suicide. In the second battle, Brutus's forces were completely routed. Facing capture, Brutus also killed himself, reportedly saying, "Virtue, I have followed you through life, but you were only a name." With the deaths of Brutus and Cassius, the Republican cause died with them. Rome would never again be a republic. The assassination that was supposed to save Roman liberty had instead destroyed it forever. The final reckoning. The irony of Caesar's assassination is almost too perfect. The conspirators killed him because they feared he would make himself king and destroy the Roman Republic. Instead, their actions led directly to the establishment of the Roman Empire under Augustus. They tried to save the Republic and ended up ensuring its destruction. Within 13 years of Caesar's death, Octavian had defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, eliminated all his rivals, and become Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. The republic that Brutus died trying to save was replaced by an imperial system that would last for over 400 years in the West and over 1400 years in the East. But perhaps the greatest irony is this: Caesar achieved in death what he might never have achieved in life. His assassination made him a martyr. His name became synonymous with absolute power, and his adopted heir founded a dynasty that would rule the Mediterranean world for centuries. The conspirators didn't kill Caesar. They made him immortal. As Shakespeare would later write, "The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones." But in Caesar's case, it was exactly the opposite. His flaws were forgotten, his achievements were magnified, and his legend grew with each passing generation. Not bad for a guy who died 2,000 years ago. The assassination of Julius Caesar remains one of history's most famous political murders because it perfectly captures the eternal struggle between individual ambition and collective governance, between progress and tradition, between the man and the system. It's a story that resonates just as powerfully today as it did in ancient Rome, which is probably why we're still talking about it 2 millennia later. So there you have it, the assassination of Julius Caesar explained. If you enjoyed this video and have yet to subscribe to this channel, then please do so now. That way you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.